I had a friend reach out to me and said that their dad had a very large and heavy trimmer they would like to get running again. I asked him what brand it was just so I could be prepared when it comes to diagnosing and fixing it. When he told me it was a Briggs and Stratton, I paused for a second and asked him to repeat himself. Yet again, he said it was a Briggs and Stratton. I didn't believe him and just thought he was confused about what brand it was, so I drove over there to see this thing for myself. When I arrived, this massive trimmer was waiting for me. What's up everyone, and thank you for stopping by. Today's project is this Briggs & Stratton trimmer. Now the problem is that it won't start. I thought it was going to be a rebranded 4-cycle trimmer from some other company, but when I saw this massive frame, I realized that I've never seen anything like this before. Just wait to hear what's hiding under all this plastic. Now, I'm going to try and repair this trimmer, however, it may not be the exact repair you need to make to yours. We'll explore other options later in the video. Now, we're only going to mention what these other options could be. We don't have enough time to look into them, but if you need more information on these options, you're welcome to ask as many questions as you need to. So what you're looking at has to be the smallest modern flathead engine, which Briggs calls a micro engine, sized at 34 cc's or 2 cubic inches. That of course means it's not an overhead valve engine with push rods, timing belts, or anything modern. They basically took their quantum engine and made it a lot smaller. Now this thing saved them a lot of money in R&D, but the problem is that it's extremely heavy. So what you're seeing here under the plastic is the top of the engine where the head goes, but as you can barely see, it looks a lot like the front of a Briggs engine, just a bunch of cooling fins and no valve cover and just a spark plug sticking out of it, which if you really think about it is a pretty ingenious idea. The next thing I want to do is try and start it, but I need to check the oil first, otherwise we could damage the engine. If you hadn't noticed, the oil dipstick looks like it came right off a Briggs engine. Now when checking the oil, make sure you wipe it off first and then screw it back into the block for an accurate reading. And it looks like there's just enough oil in the engine, so the next thing I want to do is put some fuel into the Carb's throat and try and start it. Now on the day of filming, it was a brisk 45 degrees Fahrenheit, so the plastic cover wasn't giving like it should, so to help get the cover off, I'm going to pry on it. Just be careful doing this because you can easily break something. Luckily, it started and ran for a second, which is great news. It means we have a working ignition system and enough compression from the engine, and it's not worn out. I also realized that there's something going on with the trigger or the throttle cable because it looks like the barrel is hanging up a bit. If it's a big problem, I might have to try lubricating it. If that doesn't work, I'll have to try something else. Not only is it hanging up, but it's also not going to wide open either. Now when I get the carb off, I might have to check if the problem is here or somewhere else, and I'm also not sure what's going on with this fuel line either, but it's going to be changed out along with the primer bulb because it looks like it could break at any moment. If you need either of these parts, there should be a link in the description of this video. Now, since I know the engine runs when manually primed, I'm going to put some fresh 89 octane 100% gasoline with no ethanol in the tank, prime the fuel system, and then try and start it. So I've been pressing the bulb for a while now, and I haven't seen or heard any fuel make it to the bulb. It's also at this point that the bulb decided to break right in the middle. Now it's not a total loss, but we need to get gasoline up to the carb, and another way to do that is to pull on the rope several times. As long as the pumping section is in working order, this should work. After pulling on it several times, I still don't see any gasoline in either of the lines. That means we need to take the carb off for an inspection. Now after pouring out the fuel, I had a look inside the tank and noticed that the fuel line in the tank did not have a filter on it, which is not a good thing. That means we might have some debris in the carb and it's probably clogging up the inlet screen. That would make sense as to why we can't get any gasoline to make it to the carb. If I move the lever that rotates the barrel, you can see that it springs right back into place. That means the problem has to be with our throttle cable or trigger. I don't want to focus on it right now, so I'll try a temporary fix later on. My main focus is to open the carb up for an inspection. Now after opening the carb, I'm very surprised to see that the metering diaphragm looks to be brand new, which is very strange, and after removing it from the gasket, it's also not stuck to it, which definitely means it's brand new. So it would seem that someone recently replaced these two parts but still couldn't get the engine to work because I don't see any residual fuel inside the carb. The next thing I want to check is the pumping diaphragm, which is under the pumping section, and I was wondering why it was a bit tough to take apart, and now I know why. It looks as though that someone put the spring in the wrong section of the carb and it had seated itself into the gasket. The worst part is that the spring has damaged this part of the gasket, so there's a good chance it's been compromised. The other problem that I see is that the inlet screen has been installed poorly, so it's letting fuel pass by it. There's a good chance that if I remove the diaphragm, there's going to be a lot of debris in the pumping section, and that would explain why it's not priming either. And after removing it along with the gasket, sure enough, there's quite a bit of debris here. This sort of news is not very promising for this carb. I've always said that if you take a carb apart and find that the pumping diaphragm was bad, to just buy a new carb. I guess I'll have to amend that statement to also include the gasket as well. I've also said that if you put a carb back together and it's still not priming, to take the carb apart for further cleaning, but in this case it won't matter because of the condition of this carb. I'm going to do you a favor and save you about 3 minutes of video time by not showing you the entire process of how I clean this carb, because in the end, it didn't work. But I do want to show you what happened after I got it installed. That way, you'll see what this carb did and didn't do after a very extensive cleaning. But before I forget, I'm going to spray some lubricant into the throttle cable area so it'll fix our sticking issue. Then I'll have to replace the fuel lines, especially since we're missing the fuel filter. I'll just pull these old lines out of the way and then replace them with some yellow fuel line, which is supposed to be more ethanol resistant. To help get the line in the openings in the tank, I like to cut the ends at an angle. Now the angle is up to you, but I would try something fairly sharp. Now the first line I'll be running is the return line, so I'm not going to bother cutting the angle piece off. I'll just push about 2 inches of line into the tank so it won't come out. The next line I'll be running will be the fuel filter line. Now this one I'll have to treat a little differently. Now I'll have to push a lot of line into the tank, that way I can pull the end of the line out of the tank and cut the angle piece off. That way I can install the fuel filter. Now once the filter is installed on the line, I'll push it back into the tank and make sure there's plenty of line in the tank so the filter can reach the bottom. Now once the fuel lines have been ran, I'll then install the old carb that I tried to clean, and I'm going to show you what happens when something like this occurs. Now there's supposed to be an air filter here, but as you can see it's gone. When mowing season comes back around, I'll buy a filter for it. Now, I'm not 100% sure as to which fuel line goes where, but I'm going to guess that the larger brass port is for the fuel filter line, while the smaller plastic barb is for the return line. If I'm wrong, I'll swap the lines, but I'm pretty sure that's the way it goes. Now, once the lines have been connected, I'll put some gasoline into the tank and then try priming the fuel system. So when pressing the primer bulb, fuel should come up through the filter line into the carb, then partially fill the bulb, and then leave the carb through the return line and back to the tank. So after pressing the bulb several times, it's still not priming, which is a terrible sign. Now we could try to help it along by pulling on the rope, that way the carb's pump will then pull fuel from the tank. After pulling on the rope several times, I still don't see any fuel in the filter line. We'll have to try to manually prime the carb and then try to start the engine. If this doesn't work, there's only one choice left. So unfortunately, it still didn't work, which means we can either take the carb apart and try to figure out if we did something wrong or clean it, but since I know this carb is probably clogged with debris and the pumping gasket is damaged, I'm opting to just buy a new carb instead. So I decided to only order the carb and not the full repair kit with a new plug, fuel filter, and lines. That means I only get the carb and the engine side gasket, but before I install it, I'm going to compare the two of them just to make sure they look pretty much the same. Once that's done, I'll then install it. I'm glad they sent a new gasket because the original one was stuck to the back side of the old carb. Trying to remove it was more than likely going to damage it. Before I slide the carb on the studs, I'm going to prime the fuel system just to make sure it's working. Now fuel should flow through the lines just the same way I mentioned a little earlier. And after pressing it several times, I can see fuel moving through the lines and into the bulb and finally returning back to the tank, which is exactly what we want. The last thing we need to do is to finally install this new carb to the engine along with the air filter base, then we'll finally try and start the engine. Now I know I'm going to get some comments about putting that old carb in an ultrasonic cleaner, but remember that the gasket for the pumping diaphragm was also damaged when it was reassembled incorrectly, so I think I'd be wasting my time doing that. Now, with it being so cold out here, I might have to wait a little longer as the engine gets warmer before I move it out of full choke. So it finally started, and it seems to be running okay, but every time I tried to move the choke lever, it wanted to die. Luckily, as the engine got warmer, the engine needed less fuel to keep running, so after a couple of minutes, it didn't need any choke at all. It's still kind of warm, so I should be able to start this thing right back up. I don't really like giving up on carbs, but the best use of my time was to just replace it. It's just a real shame that the last person who worked on it made a few mistakes and took some shortcuts that basically put us here in this situation. So another option as to why this engine wasn't starting is that the gasket between the engine and the carb is either missing or installed incorrectly. Now the pulses from the engine pass through to the carb to work the pump through a passage that's sealed by this gasket, and with it missing or installed correctly, the engine may not run. So the cost for this repair was $16 for the carb and about $2 for the fuel lines. That means this repair was less than $20 and it took about 2 hours to film and fix. So I don't know what they intend on doing with this monster trimmer. I certainly don't want to use it. The only thing that it's good for is probably to clear brush. I guess it's probably going to end up on the wall of their garage where it's probably never going to be used. Personally, I think the best use for this thing, because it's a 4-cycle engine, is a mud motor for a canoe. Although I got rid of my canoe years ago, I think it would have been pretty cool to have installed it on there. So my question is, what would you do with this tiny Briggs lawnmower engine? Would you use it on a bicycle, or maybe on a stand-up scooter, or how about an RC car or boat? Or would you just leave it alone and use it as a monster trimmer? Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions, and I hope to see you in the next video.